Madagascar only a couple of centuries ago had animals like Megalatopus. Megalatopus literally means like the giant lemur. And it is a like small gorilla sized like koala.
Hello, today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Matthew Borths, curator at the Duke Lima Center Museum of Natural History. So welcome, Dr. Borths. Could you please share a brief overview of your career in research and also what sparked your passion for paleontology?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about all things fossils with you today. I guess my career and my passion for paleontology are kind of wrapped up with each other. I think like a lot of kids, I was first introduced to fossils as a kid. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is kind of middle-ish of the United States. And it is just on Ordovician fossiliferous bedrock. Like every building in Cincinnati is just built from trilobites and brachiopods. And so fossil hunting was something that I just did in my backyard because you could go back there and just find like literally tons of fossils. So I was always very aware of kind of deep time that the place that I lived had been different, that the place that was Cincinnati, Ohio, that is cornfields and rolling hills of the Ohio River Valley, was once a tropical ocean. And so like that idea that there was this like tropical sea that was where I lived is something I don't remember a time I didn't know that. And that idea of the deep past being so different from the present has always been really intriguing thing. And of course, like the most intriguing for a kid is then dinosaurs, because they're like dragons that actually lived. And that idea of these creatures that stomped around the planet and are no more, but we're part of this world as much as I am, is again this really like amazing idea. And so lots of drawing dinosaurs, but also drawing dragons, like the kind of myth and storytelling gets all wrapped up with each other. And then Jurassic Park hit at a very important time when I was in second grade. And that creates this whole world of books and TV shows that like fueled my interest. And so I'm not unique. I know that I am part of this like bump in paleontology that happens as a result of just not just Jurassic Park itself, but Jurassic Park demonstrated there's this hunger for information about these extinct creatures that then just kind of really hasn't stopped rolling since then. The problem was that all that literature has things like Tyrannosaurus Rex was this long and it was this tall, and Velociraptor was this tall and this long, and the sense of like, well, they've named and found all these things and we know what they look like and maybe someday we'll clone them, but like, is there anything left to do? And so I kind of had this sense that I had arrived into paleontology too late, and that in science in general had been like done. And so I drifted, like as I got older, middle school, high school, into other things. I remained interested in history on some level, like this idea of the changing past and present. But it wasn't until I got to university that I happened to have a job through a friend's dad in a civil engineering company, where I would go out to job sites where they were getting ready to construct like a big warehouse. And I would go out and like help the civil engineers describe section of rock. And through him, I learned like, oh, he had taken like geology classes and learned about ancient Ohio and what the world had been like around us in an academic way. I was like, oh, that's cool. That might be a class I'd like to take in college, and became interested in engineering in this way. That I take a historical geology class. It's taught by a paleontologist. And it's like, well, that guy isn't just reciting facts that we've known for a long time. Like he isn't a researcher who's doing this stuff. His name was Dr. Bill Osich. And I went to his office hours and asked like, what do you do? And do you need help? And he was very generous with his time and expertise and invited me to work on an undergraduate research project. And that was working on crinoids, which are basically like starfish on sticks. They're a group of echinoderm. They're really beautiful organisms that today are mostly brittle stars. And there's a couple of other groups that they're mostly like deep sea creatures at this point. But in the past, they have these beautiful fossils that are scattered all over the rocks that I grew up on. But he wasn't doing field work. And I was like, part of this paleontology thing is like going and looking for this stuff. And so there's another researcher at Ohio State where I was an undergraduate who was interested in the Cretaceous Tertiary boundary. He would go out and look for Paleogene mammals from right after the extinction of the dinosaurs in eastern Montana and western North Dakota, named John Hunter. And so John Hunter was going into the field, and he invited me because he was looking for a small crew to go look for tiny little mammals. And so that's how I kind of like got into research paleontology. So I always say, like, it wasn't until college that I discovered that there was still a world to discover. And that's an important part of why, even going into university, I wasn't totally sure exactly what I wanted to do. But part of going to university for me was about discovering the possibilities that were out there and rediscovering this passion that I'd had from a very young age. So it's like I had it and it faded, but then it kind of got reignited in this research context, which is very cool. And much to the disappointment of my 5-year-old self, I don't work on dinosaurs now. My career is much more focused on the mammals, which is where I worked with John Hunter. And part of the reason for that is I find the Cenozoic to be endlessly fascinating, because it is a time when there's so much more interaction between kind of shifting climates. The ocean currents are changing in dramatic ways. The continents themselves are moving. We start the Cretaceous, we end the Cretaceous basically with all these island continents. You have Australia and South America and Africa. Really all the continents are separate from each other, and you get some exchange periodically between them, but it also creates all these laboratories for experimentation, which then becomes a really important part of what I like to think about as a researcher, is convergent evolution. And the Age of Mammals presents a lot of opportunities to study that in a way that the Age of Dinosaurs is a little more disappointing. Like, it starts as a place where if you find a theropod, you find a meat-eating dinosaur, and it's going to be, there aren't like meat-eating dinosaurs that came out of non-meat-eating groups or something like that. Whereas what I study for my dissertation, I actually focus on carnivore evolution. And so comparing this group of animals called hyenodonts, which their name means hyena tooth, but they are not closely related to hyenas at all. They're kind of a whole different experiment in being a meat-eating mammal. They build their skulls and teeth in very idiosyncratic ways, but they converge in a lot of ways with sparacidonts, which are a group of meat-eating basically marsupials that live in South America. They look a lot like thylacines and Tasmanian devils in South America or in Australia. And so there's these really interesting kind of convergences that then they also converge with like true carnivores, like things like wolves and hyenas. And so like being able to make those comparisons is one of the reasons why I focus on the Cenozoic, and is where I am today. And so now I am at the Duke Lemur Center Museum of Natural History, because the research that I did on carnivore evolution was closely tied to the story of primates. Primates as a group originate, as far as we can tell, in the northern continents, but then they find their way into Africa. And then from Africa, they find their way to South America and Madagascar. And hyenodonts as a group seem to originate in the northern continents. They get into Africa. There seem to be some exchanges between Africa and Eurasia. And so the biogeographic questions raised by hyenodont relationships also tie into primate relationships. And so I've always had my kind of finger on the pulse of primate evolution as a result of that. My research advisor, Eric Seifert, is a paleoprimatologist. And so being at the Lemur Center has given me this chance to work on things from South America and things from Africa and things from Madagascar and things from Eurasia that are all and from North America. That are all tied into these initial research questions I had for my dissertation, but have kind of grown into like larger mammal questions. It's not just the carnivores I care about anymore. It's also the primates and the horses and the other creatures that we find in the same context.
Thank you. And is there a figure from the history of paleontology you particularly admire? And if so, what is it about their work or career that stands out to you?
Yeah, I love the history of paleontology. I love the kind of process of thinking about the world being different and the slow. So like, I'm really fascinated by the early history of paleontology in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, like there's kind of classic responses. Like I have my favorites in your Darwin, but Darwin being especially exciting just because of, I think he's a really important just evolutionary biologist for us all to admire, because he was so cautious and circumspect in the way that he collected data and then interpreted those data. But then as we get more into the world of actual paleontology. I think I mean, one of the people who I really admire is honestly my predecessor here. His name is Greg Gunnell. And Greg is not a particularly famous person from the history of paleontology, but he's a really important one because he really valued getting students into the field and giving young people the opportunity to kind of discover and work on their own. And so there are a lot of paleontologists who, like, their first field experience was going out with Greg Gunnell. And so he kind of quietly helped like facilitate this whole world of people interested mostly in mammal evolution. The other thing that I think is important about Greg is he was a paleontologist who was not like so focused on one set of questions or one piece of anatomy or one group of animals. And so that kind of diversity of perspective that he had. So he worked on primates. His research was really grounded in North American faunas from like the early Eocene into the middle Eocene. And that meant he was looking at kind of like the early diversity of mammals as a group. And as you know, we go from these archaic groups that we can't quite figure out what orders or families they might belong to into something that we recognize as equidae or something we recognize as a primate. And so I think a lot of paleontologists become a little more siloed, like me, where it's just kind of like I'm excited about like finding a carnivore, like I want to find a carnivore. Greg was just like so expansive in his knowledge, and that meant that there was this fossil that had been found in Kenya in the 1960s called Propado. And it was found by another one of my favorite paleontologists from the history of paleontology named George Gaylord Simpson. And George Gaylord Simpson was a mammologist, and he was also a science popularizer. He wrote a lot of books for the general public about paleontology. And he was also a really interesting figure who was trying to figure out, like, he was working in the middle of the 20th century, how to incorporate questions about genetic information coming into the fossil record. So he was part of what we call like the synthesis, when like genetic information comes together with morphological information. And he found, or like he was assigned the task of figuring out what this old jaw was. And this jaw looked to him a lot like a loris. It had kind of like a large incisor. It had kind of flat teeth. So he named it Propado, which means like the thing before a loris. Publishes it. And then another interesting paleontologist named Alan Walker. Alan Walker was a paleontologist interested in African faunas. He writes a letter to Simpson and says, I don't think it's a potto. I think you actually found a fruit bat. And so this is after it's published, and Simpson had named it Propado, like but you're stuck with the name. Like there's a lot of examples through paleontology of animals that are kind of misnamed because we learned later more about their morphology. Basilosaurus is a famous one, where Basilosaurus sounds like a dinosaur, but is in fact a whale. And so George Gaylord Simpson like went to his deathbed, like mourning that he had named this animal Propado, because he like looked at a fruit bat and looked at Alan Walker's assessment and said, you know, I'm really frustrated with myself. Good observations. I'm glad that you know more about these animals than I do. Greg Gunnell in like 2016, 2015, goes to Kenya to look at Propado because Greg is an expert on bat evolution and also on primate evolution, kind of like all primates in general, or all mammals. And so he's holding this thing that's supposed to be a fruit bat, and he's looking at it. It's like, this isn't a fruit bat. Like it's actually, and he sends this email to another researcher that says, like, tell me I'm crazy, but he interpreted it as an eye relative. It had this long incisor and these kind of flat teeth that looked a lot like what we find in eyes. Fortunately, because he was my predecessor, was at the Duke Lemur Center. And so he was able to get a lot of dental impressions of eyes, especially juvenile eyes, and compare those to what he saw in Propado. And so in 2019, a paper came out that kind of announced Propado as one of the oldest fossil eye relatives. And then there was another animal that was from Egypt that's also in this collection that had also been possibly thought to be a loris relative that then gets connected to the story of eyes. And so eyes is really remarkable primates that have always weird adaptations. And so Greg, because he had this breadth of comparative experience, was able to kind of like come into this debate that had happened like decades earlier and bring new information, new data to it, because he kind of remained a generalist in a way that I think it's important sometimes for all of us to remember to become generalists, that there is value in knowing about more than just like the thing we did our dissertations on and then the things that our students are working on. So I will always admire Greg Gunnell as one of my paleontology kind of heroes and pole stars.
I was going to ask a lemur question later, but I'll ask one now about the ii because it's so interesting. Because that paper, I think that and another couple of specimens related potentially to the ii is kind of potentially changing our understanding of migration to Madagascar. How has that changed in the field in the last few years, this perspective that maybe there was more than one wave?
Yeah, no, and that was an important part of this observation. So iis as a group, so they're part of lemurs, and lemurs are strepsirrhine primates. So they're primates that they have longer noses than monkeys and apes do. There's a lot of kind of anatomical variation. They have tooth combs, they have grooming claws, but otherwise they're primates. They have thumbs that grasp and big toes that grasp, and relatively large brains and complicated social lives. iis as a group branch away from the rest of lemurs very early. We know from molecular evidence that they have a deep split from the rest of lemurs. And so but they're still a clade. They're still like a monophyletic group that are lemurs. And so the assumption had always been that split from iis to the rest of lemurs kind of marks when lemurs get to Madagascar. That's kind of the beginning of this adaptive radiation that takes place when the lemur ancestors arrive, or ancestor, like maybe a founding population, arrive in Madagascar, no primates on the island, and they diversify like crazy. The problem was that split between iis and the rest of lemurs was really old. And so you had to get lemur-like primates from the northern continents where they seem to originate into Africa and then immediately get them to Madagascar. It's just like they had didn't leave a fossil record as they kind of passed through Africa for it to like all line up. And so the discovery of ii fossils in mainland Africa, Propato and Plesiopithecus is the animal from Egypt. Both of them have these long incisors that characterize iis. Iis basically they have like rodent dentition. Essentially, it's like their front teeth are just always growing, and they use them for like burrowing into the sides of trees where they get bugs. Like there's insectivorous. They're actually omnivores. They eat kind of whatever they can find, but they're especially good at listening with their giant bat-like ears to like scritching and scratching inside of tree bark. And then they use their ever-growing teeth, like little beavers or woodpeckers, to like get into the tree bark, and then use these really super long fingers that they have, almost like kebab skewers, to like reach in and like skewer their bugs or like scrape them out and then eat them. And so those ever-growing teeth are very weird. But also their molars are very weird. The way that they're kind of like these large like basins that don't have a lot of morphology to them are very characteristic. It's interesting when you look at like the jaw of an ii, like it genuinely looks like a rodent. Like they have 3 teeth and like a big forward sticking tooth. Like it looks like a beaver. But the rest of them is clearly primate. They have huge brains. They have grasping digits and everything. So to find an animal that has the molars and the incisors of a ii in mainland Africa was like, okay, the split between the rest of lemurs and iis at least could have happened in mainland Africa, which both pushes back when primates might have gotten from mainland Africa to Madagascar. But it then creates the second problem, which is then how did iis get to Madagascar? Like the lemurs get to Madagascar separately from iis. And so it suggests like 2 different colonization events of the island from mainland Africa to Madagascar. And the way that we think primates got from Africa to Madagascar is island rafting, which is this process that has been observed in kind of bits and pieces in modern contexts, where especially mangrove swamp-like or estuary environments where plants have adapted to grow out into the water. and they're not anchored to the soil anymore. So mangroves are probably the most familiar kind of plant that does this, where instead of grabbing onto the soil, they grab onto each other, or they just kind of like let their roots dangle into the salt water or kind of estuarian, like salt freshwater mix, and they get their nutrients that way. And it's a really smart adaptation for a plant because there's lots of sunlight. If you can figure out a way to get your nutrients out of the water, and then like no one else is competing with you as you like rush out into the light, if you're in like a dense kind of forested environment. The problem is that if a big storm surge comes through, you're not anchored to anything. And so hurricanes, typhoons, cyclones, like depending where you are in the world, big storms cause a storm surge that comes up underneath these forest fragments and can snap off the forest. And then as the storm surge goes back out, it creates all this energy. It just sucks all the vegetation out to sea. And so people who are in charge of giant boats that are like going through shipping lanes all over the world are very aware of after floating vegetation mats that you have to be very careful of. And some of them can be huge. And on those mats, people have observed animals. They've observed rodents in particular, as far as mammals go, but also snakes and other kinds of reptiles and bugs. And so the working hypothesis is that is how you get animals to continents that are separate from each other. Like if they're not building boats, but they're taking advantage of these natural rafts that are being blasted around the planet. And reconstructions of past current structures between East Africa and Madagascar. Today, it's very hard to kind of get on a raft and just like float your way to Madagascar. So difficult, in fact, that humans didn't get to Madagascar until like the Holocene, as far as we can tell. So humans evolve in Africa, but they don't make it across the Mozambique Channel until only a couple thousand years ago. And the primary colonization or initial colonization seems to have been from the east. The language of Malagasy is more closely related to Sumatran than it is to any language in Africa. And so it seems like the colonization in Madagascar comes from across the Indian Ocean basin, because the currents and the winds are more favorable for going from the east to Madagascar than from the west. But in the ancient past, the current was flipped and it was easier to go from Africa to Madagascar. And so we think that that's how lemurs got from Africa to Madagascar, was on these natural rafts. But still, it seems like a very rare phenomenon. Like it's not going to happen very often. Primates as a group, there's not a lot of examples of them rafting across like vast oceans. And so for it to happen once seemed really remarkable. Then this idea that there's this split and that eyes evolve in Africa, and then also lemurs as a group are evolving in Africa, and then separately these two groups kind of cross the Mozambique Channel seems really extraordinary. But we know that there's lots of other colonization events that are taking place from Africa to Madagascar. We know that there are multiple colonizations of bats. We know that rodents make it over at least once. Carnivores as a group, this is one of the reasons I studied the relationships of carnivores to figure out the biogeography of primates, because carnivores seem especially bad at rafting. So to find carnivores crossing oceans is kind of a rare event. And there's this group of carnivores that lives in Madagascar that are called eupleurids that are most closely related to civets, so things like meerkats and civets. And they arrive. So like if carnivores are getting across, it suggests that there's a lot of potential for animals crossing from one place to another. And there's an even more extraordinary crossing that happened from Africa to South America. Like it's even further from Africa to South America. And that is how we think platyrrhine primates got from kind of their anthropoid ancestors that evolve, like their monkey-like ancestors that evolve in Africa, go across the Atlantic Ocean. And there's emerging evidence that that might have happened more than once, that there was like maybe 2 colonization events of monkeys getting from Africa to South America across like the entire Atlantic Ocean. And so for me, that raises the possibility, like the probability of multiple colonization events from Africa to Madagascar for primates then becomes more probable. But it is one of those things, like we're dealing with probabilities. Like we can't, like short of like a time machine that goes back and is like standing on the beach of Madagascar to like watch these animals like scramble off their raft. We're not going to like see like when exactly this happened, partially because the fossil record of Madagascar is really frustrating. It goes from the like end of the age of dinosaurs. There's Maastrichtian sites, so like the same time period as Tyrannosaurus Rex, But T-Rex isn't in Madagascar. Instead, the Majungasaurus is a T-Rex-like dinosaur. It's a big carnivore. It's one of the true unicorns. It has like one horn on the top of its head, which is very fun. But Majungasaurus is like the last of the terrestrial record of Madagascar. And there's a little blip of material that could be really, really exciting that a researcher named Karen Sammons is working on in northern Madagascar that may give us some stuff from the Miocene of Madagascar, but so far it doesn't have any primates in it. There's some bat material, there's some sea cow material, which is really exciting, but Karen is really diligently working on all that material. So maybe someday we'll find some primate material up there. But otherwise, the fossil record of Madagascar then is very, very recent. And so the story of Madagascar can only really be told from the perspective of Africa, where like as we find lemur-like primates in mainland Africa, that creates this context for like who could be moving over to Madagascar. And so the discovery of this ancient II relative that had evolved in Egypt and then like leaves fossil record in Kenya, like they're in the right place and they're at the right time. And then it makes sense to kind of ship one across the Mozambique Channel. And then later a lemur-like primate. We find tooth comb bearing primates in the fossil record of Madagascar, of Africa, from 34 million years ago. So we know that lemur-like strepsirrhines, true strepsirrhines, were in Africa at the right place in the right time to also go across. Which then raises the question of like why monkeys didn't do it. Like monkeys went across the Atlantic Ocean. Like why aren't there monkeys in Madagascar? And that is an open question. Like, I don't know. They could have been there. Like for all we know, there were monkeys in the Eocene of Madagascar. But until we have a fossil record for the Eocene of Madagascar, we don't know. But we do know that there are primates and that they're there today. They're all lemurs. They're all closely related to each other. But this II is very, very distantly related to the rest of the lemurs. And he may have arrived separately from all of his cousins.
So like, yeah, you've mentioned most continents, South America, Africa, but
yeah,
not North America yet. So I'll ask a North American primate question. So
Great.
Wyoming has produced a rich fossil record of primates as well, but older than the material you've mentioned, so 50 million years ago, some of the oldest primate material. So you've undertaken fieldwork there and prepared some remarkable new fossils. So can you share a bit about the history of the discoveries from these and other excavations and what they've revealed about early primate evolution?
Yes. Yeah. So the North American fossil record is always kind of a surprise. Like in our museum here at the Duke Lemur Center, kind of our centerpiece is an animal called Netharctus. And Netharctus is one of these early lemur-like primates. And when I say lemur-like, it's a stem strepsirrhine. It's missing. It doesn't have a tooth comb yet. It doesn't have like the one grooming claw on its foot. It looks a lot like a lemur. Like if you saw this animal in life, I don't think you would like kind of think twice without, if you knew what a lemur was, I guess. Then if you didn't know what a lemur was, you'd think it was like a weird looking cat. But if you did know what a lemur was, you'd look at this and be like, that's a kind of a lemur with a smallish brain. Like it has like the back of its head. They weren't as intelligent maybe as some of the other primates we have running around today. But Netharctus is one of these early strepsirrhines that is living in North America. And it's part of a group called Adapiformes. And it's a group that's found in North America, Asia, and in Europe. And there are some remarkable fossils of these animals. So there's an animal called Ida that is that's an Adapiform from Germany that's preserved from the Messel locality in Germany. And Messel is famous for being an oil shale that preserves things like hair and gut contents. It's a Lagerstätten, which means like you don't just get the bones, you get like the entire thing. The problem is that a lot of things from Messel are flat, like they are just pancaked in a way that it can be hard to study like the 3D geometry of like the hips or the fingers or the brain. What's amazing about the sites we have from North America, and especially the series of sites that we have in what's called the Bridger Formation of Wyoming. It's kind of the southwestern corner of Wyoming, near the border with Utah. And that area is just like just east of the Rocky Mountains. Like the Rockies as a mountain chain pop up at the end of the age of dinosaurs and the beginning of the age of mammals. Excuse me. So the erosion of the Rocky Mountains is what creates these huge basins that then fill in with sediment that's been broken down from the rising Rocky Mountains and preserve in this beautiful kind of layer cake-like way the story of the end of the age of dinosaurs and the beginning of the age of mammals. And that's why we get like amazing dinosaurs from the end of the age of dinosaurs, things like Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus Rex. It's why we preserve kind of the stardust layer, where you get this iridium anomaly where an asteroid impact and its fallout basically is preserved in this layer. And then on top of that, you get the beginning of the age of mammals, because there was just this, all hell was breaking loose for life on Earth, but the mountains were still rising and being eroded. And we get this constant kind of day by day almost account of what's going on. And so we go to this section that is in the early Eocene, where we get primates first arriving in North America. And it's interesting, they arrive in North America about 56 million years ago. So it's like 10 million years after the extinction of dinosaurs. That's also when they seem to appear in the European fossil record. And so the working hypothesis is somewhere in Asia, where we don't have a great fossil record from this window, primates as a group originate and then find their way to Europe and North America. But in North America, we then get this spectacular record of primates really diversifying, and especially the Adapiforms, this group of animals that look like lemurs, have this kind of flourishing abundance in a world that today, if you go to Wyoming, it's the Badlands that earn their name, that is buttes of just dry nothingness, that are beautiful to walk through if you have a water bottle. But if you don't, it's really bad. And so it's a bad place to be a primate, because primates, they love a tree, they love some water, they love being able to just like hang out in the shade. Fortunately, during the early Eocene, northern parts of the world were much more lush than they are today. We're dealing with a greenhouse environment. The end of the Paleocene, beginning of the Eocene, we call the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. And it's become a really interesting research area, because it's this spike in CO2 that's consistent with kind of what climate models are projecting for what our climate's going to look like in the very recent or the very near future, which is stressful, but also it's useful to have a geological comparison to draw from to understand what the consequences of that kind of CO2 in the atmosphere can do. And what it does is, like, there's alligators in Greenland, and there's primates living in Wyoming. And so it's really fascinating to kind of dig into these early faunas from this time. So these primates that we go out and look for, one of the reasons why they're so interesting and important for understanding primate evolution is, instead of finding them as pancakes, we find them in 3 dimensions. And especially in the Bridger Formation, we get skeletons. So this Nitharctus that we have here is preserved kind of in like semi-articulation. She's kind of like roadkill, where like different pieces are kind of drifted apart. But we have almost the entire skeleton. And one of the things that we've done is, and this is all in collaboration with Doug Boyer, who is a really important paleoanthropologist who works here at Duke as well, is we've prepared the blocks so that we can then do a CT scan of the skeleton kind of while it's still in the rock, and then go through meticulously kind of digitally removing the bone from the rock. So we get these kind of 3D models of the bone, but we can keep the bone in articulation. So we have like her vertebral column is partially articulated. And so we can preserve that, then like individually segment out like pieces of her backbone and look at them in 3 dimensions, so that a researcher who's interested in kind of like the evolution of lumbar support in primates, which becomes a really important part of how like primate postures work and how locomotion in primates have evolved, we can connect to these 3-dimensional skeletons that we find in Wyoming. There's also more fragmentary material. We can get lots of great information out of the little jaws that we find, and like bits and fragments of like the upper parts of the skull. But when we find more complete material, that gets very exciting. And that's something that we can find in the western parts of North America.
Thank you. And moving forward in time now to the late Eocene and Oligocene, the Fayum Depression in Egypt is another of the world's key fossil sites for primate evolution. So can you share a brief history of excavations and finds from these deposits and explain why the Fayum is so important for understanding our own evolution?
Yeah, the Fayum is this incredible window, and one that we're very lucky to have, because primates are evolving in the northern parts of the world, in Europe and Asia and North America, but then they go extinct. And that happens like by the end of the Eocene, it seems, which is one of the reasons why studying the Wyoming animals is so interesting. It's like there is this diversity of them. And then there's a crash in that diversity, and what drives primate extinction becomes an important question, because right now most primates are endangered. Fortunately, some of those primates found natural rafts, and they got from the northern continents, likely from Eurasia, into Africa. Africa, during the beginning of the age of mammals, is an island continent. It's cut off from the rest of the world. There's no land bridges to walk from anywhere in Europe or Asia into Africa. The Arabian Peninsula is now the connection between Africa and Eurasia, but that doesn't really swing and connect the two continents until about like 20 million years ago. So for the first like 40 million years of the age of mammals, Africa is an island. And so in order for primates to get there, we're talking about rafting from Africa to Madagascar, but we also need to get them rafting from Eurasia into Africa. And we know from the North American, European, and Asian record that the split between the monkey-like primates and lemur-like primates had already happened in the north. And so we know that there were at least two separate rafting events that lead to a monkey-like primate and a lemur-like primate have to get from Eurasia to Africa. And so once they're in Africa, then they start to diversify. They go extinct in the north. And so if that rafting event hadn't happened in that early step of kind of African evolution, then we just wouldn't be here talking, because primates go extinct everywhere except Africa. And so Africa then becomes like the cradle of primate diversity. And it's a really important cradle, but the problem is that it doesn't have a great fossil record. Unlike Western North America, where the Rocky Mountains are popping up just conveniently at the same time that early mammal evolution is taking place, Africa doesn't have kind of a massive uplift. Like most of the kind of tectonic activity that's happened in Africa that's interesting for the paleoanthropological fossil record is all this East African material that's available from the relatively recent parts of the Cenozoic because of the rifting of the East African rift. And that rift is partially responsible for when the Arabian Peninsula swings out and connects Africa with the rest of Eurasia. But that hasn't happened yet. Like we're still like Africa is kind of a quiet tectonic place. And so fortunately, there was some minor deposition taking place on the northern coast of Africa in Egypt. And so the Fayum is essentially like the beach. It's like a mangrove swamp estuary environment that is along the coast of northern Africa. And the deposits really start in like the late Eocene, and what we start to get from the marine record of the Fayum are early whales, which are really amazing creatures. Things like Basilosaurus and Dorodon, which are these early whales that have like they still have like pelvies and feet. They weren't very useful. These are animals that are very committed to being in the water, but they're called archaeocetes, which means like ancient whales. And the Fayum is really important for understanding the early evolution of whales. Meanwhile, on land, primates are really diversifying. The things that were monkey-like primates that get in from Eurasia to Africa have become true monkeys. We have animals that like Egyptopithecus and like Catopithecus that if you saw them perched in a tree, again, you'd just be like, that's a monkey. Like it wouldn't be at all faze any of us to kind of observe like that's definitely a primate. It has grasping hands and feet, has a relatively large brain. Egyptopithecus probably had a complicated social life. We know from variation in the way that their faces are built and the way that their teeth are built that there's a variation in like large males and relatively small females, and this is consistent with multi-male, multi-female troops. And so the beginnings of like complicated primate social lives are kind of preserved in the fossil record of the Fayum. And it's an amazing diversity of these animals. There's just tons of species of primates that are very happily living in what were probably these mangrove-like or swamp-like forested environments that were along the coastline of northern Africa. And they're living alongside early elephant relatives. They're living alongside early lemur relatives because they're also present. And it's interesting at the end of the Eocene where the Fayum preserves this really important inflection point between the end of the Eocene and the early Oligocene. The Eocene-Oligocene boundary I think of as like the birth of the modern world. It's when like Antarctica finally disconnects from all the rest of the southern continents. It breaks its tie with Australia and with South America. And what that means is like having this island continent parked on the South Pole of our planet. Water that used to go from the equator, it would go down and kind of bounce off Antarctica. But because it was like there were cul-de-sacs in every direction, it would basically bounce off the continent. It would get cold because it was the pole, it was far away from the equator, but then it would go back up to the equator and get warm again. And so nowhere got like too cold at any time. But then once you sever the tie between Antarctica and the rest of the continents, you create this giant current that goes all around Antarctica. And cold water that goes down there stays cold and just gets trapped. And it's cold, 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 cold. And you create an air conditioning unit on the bottom of our planet. That creates continental ice sheets that form first in Antarctica and then start to kind of trigger formation in the north. And so from that time forward, that's like the birth of the Oligocene. We start to get periods of icehouse and greenhouse that are pulsing throughout the rest of the Cenozoic. So that's the climate regime that we live in today, is when it's kind of driven by how much water is available that's trapped in ice versus how much has been released from the ice. And that had different impacts on different continents. It's kind of hard to tease apart what the Eocene-Oligocene boundary meant for animals everywhere. But what seems to have happened in Africa is because we have the Fayum as this like beautiful little window into the Eocene-Oligocene boundary, is the Eocene is a world where you're kind of like evenly divided between strepsirrhine or like lemur-like primates and the anthropoid primates, the monkey-like primates. There's like even diversity between them. Going into the Oligocene, the monkeys really take over. And there's a lot of possible reasons for that. One, based on dental topography, might be that the monkeys are dentally generalists, like they're able to kind of live in a drier world that's more variable, and the strepsirrhines kind of start to lose diversity in the face of that. Fortunately, they make it to Madagascar, where strepsirrhines are hugely diverse and are able to adapt to all kinds of like dry and wet environments. So, you know, how much like the strepsirrhine body plan is constrained is really hard to say, because it's fine in Madagascar. It just didn't work out as well in mainland Africa. But in the Fayum, we get this record of this, like the diversification of monkeys and eventually apes kind of taking over in Africa. And it's really important in the Fayum because it's kind of our best record for any of that story. Like with the entire continent of Africa, and the Fayum is our only like fossil rich window into that time period. There's this quest that's ongoing to find more pockets of fossils from the Eocene and Oligocene of Africa. And they've been found. There's a little pocket of Oligocene in Tanzania. There's a pocket of Eocene down in Namibia. There's a little bit, and these are like very relatively recent discoveries, but nothing compares to the abundance of material that we have in the Fayum. So that becomes like the way we can interpret these more fragmentary sites. And it tells us basically about Africa when it was an island continent, which was a weird place.
Thanks. And you've already done the background of how lemurs made it from Africa to Madagascar, but you mentioned the diversity of lemur species. But even in the recent past, there was even greater diversity. And you mentioned the lack of a fossil record, but there's some recent material called subfossils where you've got a lot of collections at the Duke Lemur Center. So I wonder if you could talk about those specimens and the kind of the great diversity, and especially the giant lemurs that are part of that collection.
Yeah. So lemurs as a group, once they get to Madagascar, or different groups get to Madagascar, they eventually diversify. There's an interesting kind of lag again in their diversification, but they like suddenly radiate into these big families. And today we have, what's that, somewhere around 100 species that live on the island. But from the subfossil record, we know that diversity was even greater in the very recent past. We call it the subfossil collection because they are so recent. They're not really like fossilized. It's basically still bone. Some of these specimens that we find are only a couple of centuries old, maybe a couple of decades in some cases. And a lot of these fossils come from cave deposit sites or river deposit sites or lake deposits. And all of that is pretty recent. So yeah, like I said, Madagascar, like Africa, hasn't had kind of a large mountain building event in its recent past, and it doesn't geologically create really nice like low-lying basins that can like fill up with fossils in this layer cake like way. There's some areas that might have done that, but then the second thing you need to have happen is you need to like fracture that layer cake so that things that are really old that are at the bottom of your basin get like exposed on the surface. And so that faulting hasn't happened in Madagascar. So there may be very ancient fossils that are preserved like under the bedrock of like the highland plateaus in Madagascar, but they are like miles down. And so actually getting those things to the surface requires kind of a tectonic shift that is continents smashing into each other and separating from one another and mountains building, which we don't have. So we do work with what we got. And what we've got is especially the cave sites are where a lot of the information about the recent past of Madagascar comes from. There's this beautiful kind of necklace of limestones that formed along like the northern, western, and southern parts of Madagascar. And those limestones are from when Madagascar separated from mainland Africa. And you get these shallow seas that form these carbonate platforms, which is where you get limestone from. Then later, the limestone is exposed at the surface, and there's aquifers that form through these limestones where water is kind of flowing up and down through these limestone environments. And eventually they form caves. And a cave is basically when a tunnel that's made by water like eroding its way through limestone intersects with the surface. And so like this like bubble in the rock like erodes and creates either a skylight or an entrance of some kind. And that becomes basically a sewer drain for the forest where like big storms happen, things get washed into the cave. And what gets washed in over the course of the last couple of thousand years are giant lemurs and other amazing extinct creatures from Madagascar. And so Madagascar only a couple of centuries ago had animals like Megalatopus. Megalatopus literally means like the giant lemur. And it is a like small gorilla sized like koala. Like it has these like kind of short back legs and long arms. And kind of a long, like its face almost looks like a bear or a cow or something. It has this kind of like long prognathic face. And its teeth are just built for slicing leaves. Like it's a folivore as far as we can tell, but it's huge. It was living alongside things like Paleopropithecus, which is a sloth lemur. They are lemurs that are adapted for basically hanging upside down. Their hip sockets are kind of oriented in a way that looks a lot like a sloth. They have long digits that kind of let them like hook onto branches without needing a lot of muscular effort to grab on. And again, they're leaf eaters. And there are sloth lemurs that are the size of like a golden retriever. There's a sloth lemur called Archaeoindri that is one of the rarest of these extinct giant lemurs that is like the largest lemur ever. It's like actually the size of a gorilla or the size of a bear. There's only a couple of variant trees. There's like a skull of it and some limb bones. That's it. It's like it was found in like one site in central Madagascar and like it's never been found anywhere else. But it's amazing. It's huge. And it's a sloth lemur, which is interesting for thinking about this adaptation for hanging in the trees. And some discussion like maybe it was knuckle walking or something. But there's not enough kind of the rest of the anatomy for us to figure out exactly what it was doing. But there are also small sloth lemurs. There's an animal called Babacotia that is like a, kind of like a more lemur size. It's like a small dog sized animal or a cat sized animal. There were then the monkey lemurs, which is a group of lemurs that had shorter faces, relatively large brains, and they actually lost their tooth comb. So all lemurs have tooth comb, which is basically taking your lower incisors and canines and smushing them together and sticking them forward out of your face so they don't actually like connect with your upper incisors anymore. Archaeolemur and Hadropithecus are animals that kind of brought their tooth comb back into alignment with their upper incisors. So there's actually wear across the surface of the upper and lower incisors again, which is very monkey-like as far as the way that their teeth contact one another. And their teeth are built for like kind of eating whatever they want. If you found the fragment of these kind of square-shaped teeth of the monkey lemurs, like you would just think it was a monkey if you like dropped it in Africa. There's a few details that if you were wise to what you were looking at, you could maybe figure out that it doesn't belong exactly to a monkey, but it's kind of amazing how much those animals have converged with monkeys, and their skeletons are really well known. And it seems like they spend a lot more time on the ground than other kinds of lemurs. and they're found everywhere. Like the archaeolemur in particular is just like in every cave site you find some of this animal. So they were hugely abundant and diverse, and now they're dead. They lived in a world that also had giant elephant birds, which were birds that were like 10, 12 feet tall that laid 2-gallon yolked eggs, which are like the largest birds that have ever walked the planet. It goes back and forth between them and the moa. But elephant birds are like really heavy. They're really thick in the way they're built. So at least the heaviest bird, if not the tallest. There were mini hippos that were the size of pigs there are no hippos in Madagascar anymore. So there's all these creatures that are part of this world that giant lemurs were a part of. And so these giant lemurs were there, and some of them have radiocarbon dates that are from the very recent past. Megalatopus maybe went extinct 500 years ago. Paleopropithecus, the sloth lemurs, actually not the largest, the second largest sloth lemur, maybe 300 years ago. And so we just miss seeing these animals in a way that's really frustrating, but is also consistent with today. Lemurs in Madagascar are highly, highly endangered animals. And so the extinction pressures that led to the extinction of these giant lemurs is likely ongoing, which is as people in Madagascar, as do people everywhere, continue to become more abundant and use more of the land around them for sustenance, creates less space for lemurs. And so that's where we find ourselves today.
So yeah, the last question is always something outside of your research directly. So you've also done a lot of public science communication, from creating your own podcast and producing videos, including with fossil material. So why do you think it's important to involve the public in science, and particularly in paleontology?
I think that paleontology, much like, we're all biased by the way that we get interested in these things, but that realization that I had as a kid that the place I was living was once an ocean, I think creates this awareness that the world today, as I understand it and as I interact, is not constant, and that the world is in constant flux, that there are new species arriving, there are new species going extinct, that we affect the world around us. It is a hardy system that we live in that takes a lot to change it. Continents have to move, and ocean currents need to shift, and whole new ecosystems have to be kind of destroyed for new ones to build up, but it is not immutable. And I think that has really important implications for just how we interact with the world around us. And so that's one of the things I think is really important about paleontology, is this idea that the past is not the present, is not the future, which I think can be a very optimistic and hopeful way of going about the world too. It's not just extinction and gloom and doom, but it's also like the future doesn't have to be the past, and also doesn't have to be the present.
Thank you, Dr. Borths, for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
It's been great talking to you too.